just entered the no delusion zone. I'm David Debato. My very special guest today is Timothy Ash. Tim's been on the no delusion zone before, and I'm very glad to have him back. He is a fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Center at Chatham House in Great Britain. Tim's an economist by training and education, as well as a geopolitical analyst. He can be heard virtually every day on media platforms all over the world. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Tim Ash back to the No Delusion Zone. Welcome back, Tim.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Same here. As I said off air, we're going to pretty much stick to what's going on right now in Ukraine, and even more specifically with what's going on in Russia in terms of the economy. And I guess I'll open with that because, as I said, I know that you've written and spoken about that recently. And what I mean by that is the deteriorating situation for the Russian economy. And I know you get asked all the time, why has it taken almost 3 years of allegedly strong sanctions, the harshest sanctions placed on any country in recent or any other history? Why has Russia so far been able to weather those sanctions? And I'd like to hear your answer to that. And what is the current status of the Russian economy with those sanctions?
No, sure. Sanctions get a lot of criticism. People argue that what's the point? And then the argument they've not been very effective. I think when applied to Russia, when applied to any sanctioned economy, whether it's around North Korea or Russia, I think the key point is that sanctioned countries, they don't stand still. They try and get around them, right? And there are a lot of agents that help countries like Russia get around them. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game between the two sides. And, sanctioned countries survive, right? I mean, it's not as though everything stops. It's very hard to do that to a particular economy. Sanctioned countries, it's never particularlarly great in sanctioned countries, but they learn to get around sanctions and they divert resources, particularly when an economy is at war like Russia, from peaceful means to a war economy. We've seen that in Russia's case. They've gone from spending around 4% of GDP on defense to around 10% of GDP on defense. I think that perhaps the difference when we go way back and we think of the initial imposition of sanctions on Russia by the West, the key point to think in mind is that the only one person knew this war was going to happen, and that is Putin, right? Putin had a long time to plan for it. I would argue that since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Putin has been thinking and strategizing about a full-scale invasion, right? He knew it was going to happen. He had a long time to prepare for that. He built up resources and defenses, so he deleveraged, he reduced the vulnerabilities of the Russian economy, so ensured that Russia was running a fiscal surplus, a budget surplus, and a current account surplus, and he had 600 billion in foreign exchange reserves. So, when sanctions eventually came, there was a lot of durability to insulate the Russian economy. I think the other factor with hindsight on sanctions is that the West was very eager to maintain a unified response. I mean, political cohesion was a big part of the way the Biden administration played it. Actually, you could go back to the Obama and then the Trump administration, first Trump administrations. They wanted to maintain unity within the Western alliance. That meant that, you had to talk to all partners before applying sanctions. And many of those countries were less reluctant to apply sanctions. They were nervous about the particular impacts on their economy. So in the end, we were too slow. We were too cautious. We were too careful to take everyone's considerations into mind. And in the end, we ended up by, as I call it, the sanctions of the highest common denominator. Right. So it slowed the rolling out of sanctions. Russia had more time to plan for it. And in the end, when they came, they were softer than I think should have been the case. So, Russia has therefore, put all those together. Putin knew it was going to happen. He had lots of buffers, lots of insulation. We were too cautious. We rolled them out too slowly. and that's meant the Russian economy had loads of time to adjust. All that said, we are beginning to see the impact, I think, of over a long period of time, Russia's durability been worn down, those buffers been run through. Interestingly, if you think of the 600 billion in foreign exchange reserves that were that Putin initially, 330 we know of Central Bank of Russia reserves have been immobilized in Western jurisdictions, so that half the amount of reserves he had to defend the Russian economy. And in recent months, we've seen the ruble weakening quite significantly. A couple of weeks ago, it went to, I think, 114, 115 against the dollar. It's recovered a bit since then. But, what that tells you is, no country wants a weaker currency. Right? A weaker currency means pass through to inflation. The Russian economy already has a problem with inflation. It shows a shortage of foreign exchange reserves. And I think what we've been seeing is the West perhaps getting a bit cleverer with sanctions. I think the Biden administration was mindful that, we had obviously US elections coming up. We had a potential change in US administration. We had widespread expectation of negotiations around the Ukraine peace deal. So there was a desire from the Biden administration to ramp up pressure on Russia. They did that. Over the summer, they sanctioned MOEX, which is a Moscow-based foreign currency exchange platform that facilitated a lot of the trade with, say, China. In recent weeks, they've sanctioned Gazprom Bank, which was a major facilitator of transacting currency for oil and energy transactions with Europe, actually, and the globe. And we've seen a lot of pressure of secondary sanctions. I mentioned at the start that a lot of individuals, corporates, and countries are quite happy to take blood money and help Russia get around sanctions. We haven't done enough to prosecute and impose costs on those entities for doing that. Actually, finally, over the summer, we saw strong messaging from US Treasury, from other allies that if you help Russia get around sanctions, you will be sanctioned yourself, you will face criminal liability, etc. And I think all those combined have made a lot more entities less willing to help Russia break sanctions. Russia's, I think, had difficulty. It can export the product, export the commodities, but it's been struggling to get the foreign exchange revenue back. So if you think again about an exchange rate, it's about demand and supply of dollars or a currency, ruble in this case. There's been a shortage of dollars and foreign currency, and that's meant that, and if the Russian central bank has seen its reserves dwindle over those 3 years, and the loss of the 330 Central Bank of Russia reserves immobilized in Western jurisdictions, it's got less money to defend the exchange rate, so they have to let the currency go. So I think they let the currency weaken. That provides a bit of insulation, but there are costs. Costs are, as I mentioned, pass through to inflation. Russia already has an inflation problem. The Central Bank of Russia responds to the inflation problem by hiking interest rates. There's a Central Bank of Russia in decision on interest rates this week on Friday. The expectation is they increase interest rates another 200 basis points to 23%. So, and higher interest rates mean lower growth, right? So, a price has been paid for all this. Many of us would argue we could have done a lot more. There's still lots more that the West can do. We'd hope that the Biden administration in the last few weeks would really step up the gas, because we think that the max pressure on Russia in this period will force Putin to the negotiating table. It will weaken his position. It will strengthen the position of Ukraine in those negotiations.
Well, you made some excellent points, of course, and one of which is that part, if not a large part of the problem, why the original sanctions, and even up till this point, were not as successful as they should be, is because we need to get a coalition. That's just the nature of the Western alliance, both EU and NATO, that they have to get a consensus of most of their members before they act. They usually do not want to act individually, and I understand that. But in this situation where there is an actual war, large-scale land war on the European continent, it just seems to me, and I've said this ad nauseum, that it's an act of both cowardice, a leadership failure for sure, and a lack of vision. Let me ask you this, Tim, being an economist, why in light of the fact that there is a large-scale land war going on in Europe right now, why haven't some countries, the United States in particular, but other large economies in the European Union, gone about it individually and ratcheted up the sanctions as much as they possibly can, whether or not the EU and NATO agrees with them? What's going on there besides what I said, cowardice and a lack of leadership?
Well, many people can be blamed in terms of where we are in the relationship with Russia and the war in Ukraine. Europe is in the front line. European European economies, particularly Germany, were too quick to buy Russian gas, etc. And countries, I think, have been too slow to be aggressive in terms of sanctions response, right? And there are many countries, or some countries in Europe, who are actively trying to block those sanctions, particularly Hungary is a good case in point. I think when we come to this idea of leadership, I think in the end, the US has to lead. The US is the leader of the free world. I mean, that's the reality. It is the at
least right now until January.
Well, yes. I think the Biden administration could have done a lot more. I think of things like, moving from immobilization of Russian. Look, in the end, we haven't resourced Ukraine enough. That's the reality, right? We haven't provided them with the weapons in a timely manner. They've been drip-fed resources, whether that's armaments or finance. And we now have a situation where Ukraine is definitely on the back foot, right? It is losing ground pretty rapidly. And we're at one of those situations where, we have uncertainty about the Trump administration coming in, whether it would continue to fund and arm Ukraine. The Biden administration could have taken leadership on the issue of the frozen Russian assets or immobilized Russian assets, right? I know the weight of those assets. So of the $330 billion, probably 2/3 are in Europe. Between 170 and 190 billion is in Belgium, at Euroclear. And the US, I think, has been reluctant. It's tried to encourage those countries holding those assets to make that decision. It's interesting. There was a White House statement on a G7 communique or a G7 meeting, and the White House released a communique that suggested that President Biden had called on G7 partners to accelerate efforts to release the underlying asset, right? So essentially, the Ukraine could and should have access to the full $330 billion. If it was able to access that money, it could fund its own defense. It could use a lot of that money to buy weapons from the US, even under a Trump administration. I think no Republican administration would say no to arms sales of up to $330 billion. And it would reduce the pressure on Western taxpayers. Trump, J.D. Vance made a lot of the fact that, this war has been costing the US and its allies, billions of dollars a year. The numbers are less than have been suggested by the Trump team, but still it's a significant amount of money. It is true that Western taxpayers have been funding the support for Ukraine, but actually we've had the money in our jurisdictions, $330 billion of immobilized Russian central bank reserves. That's Russian taxpayer money in our jurisdictions. And we've done nothing in reality to solve the various legal issues around accessing it for Ukraine. We have something called an ERA mechanism at the moment, which is a bit of I would call it a scam, actually. It's a $50 billion program that basically securitizes the interest stream on those assets and to give to Ukraine. I would argue that we've done that because certain European countries, Belgium in particular, but also Italy and Germany, have stalled the use of the underlying assets. The result of that is Ukraine is not getting the resources it needs, and actually Western taxpayers are having to pay for supporting the war in Ukraine. I find it absolutely extraordinary, right? And the people like Trump and Vance are right to call out the fact that Western taxpayers are paying for the war when the Russian taxpayer has not been made to pay. I mean, it's utterly extraordinary that governments in Europe are going out of their way to protect Russian taxpayer money. Russia is the aggressor. Russia invaded Ukraine. It has caused war crimes. You know, they're bombing civilian targets. They're undermining security in Europe. We have the resources in our jurisdiction, which is immobilized Russian central bank money, Russian taxpayer money. We've not done enough to do it. Now, I think the Biden administration could, through an executive order, or it could threaten to sanction Western institutions that fail to transfer those monies. For example, Euroclear. The Biden administration has the power to threaten to sanction Euroclear unless it provides those resources to Ukraine. The legal basis for their transfer is already there. It's a political will that is lacking in Europe, and we need to do more. Now, the reality is, if Ukraine doesn't get the resources and armaments to defend itself, it will lose the war. What are the consequences of Ukraine losing that war? It is potentially the collapse of Ukraine. It is tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west to destabilize Europe socially, economically, and politically. It is Russia's capture of Ukraine's now huge military-industrial complex. Russia is spending 10% of GDP now on arms. It's turned around its industries to focus on defense. It's building more tanks, more aircraft, more drones. So is Ukraine. But if Russia wins in Ukraine, it captures the whole of Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Imagine Russia plus Ukraine, their military capability would massively overwhelm Europe, would be a massive threat. So Europe does need to wake up. It needs to wake up to the reality. The Biden administration can certainly help in the last few weeks of its time in office to concentrate minds in Europe and just do whatever it needs to help Ukraine defend itself, which is actually make sure those immobilized Russian assets are freed and given to Ukraine.
Well, your comments are exactly why I say it's a matter of, or a combination of cowardice, failure of leadership, and lack of vision. It's clear to anybody who looks at this with half a brain that this is a existential crisis to the rest of Europe in the next very, very short period of time. It's been estimated by people much smarter than me that within the next 2 to maybe 6 to 8 years that Russia is going to be able to march further into Eastern Europe and God knows where after that. Let me ask you this, Tim. You mentioned about how the Vance and other Americans are critical of how much American taxpayers are having to fund this war. What about the fact that a lot of money, billions, are being poured back into the United States, into our defense industry, who is doing pretty well about arming Ukraine, not giving it away, but selling it?
No, I mean, the numbers are quite clear. The Kiel Institute of World Economy produces data. It's costing about $100 billion a year to fund Ukraine. That's military and budget and balance of payment support. Of that $100 billion, roughly, actually 2/3 has been provided by Europe. About 40% of the total is provided by the US. Of the US total, I'd say probably, again, 2/3 of the US contribution, which is probably $40 billion a year, is in military support. And most, if not, I'd say almost all, the US military support to Ukraine stays in the US because it's either old US kit that is transferred from the US military to Ukraine, and the US gets newer military production as a result of it, or it's direct purchases from US weapons industry. So, and interestingly, Vance and Trump may complain about the cost of the war, but the net result of this war, and we saw that actually in the last week or so, the NATO Secretary General has made it absolutely crystal clear that because of the continuing threat from Russia, NATO defense spending will have to go from this 2% of GDP target to probably something in excess of 3%. Now, most of that increase in defense spending is going to be by Europe, in Europe. 1 percentage point of GDP in addition is hundreds of billions of dollars more of defense spending. Who is going to get most of that? The US military industrial complex, because the war has proven that the US is still the most advanced military technological power globally. Europe will be queuing up to buy US kit, and also Ukraine will be. It's assuming there is some peace deal based on what Vance and Trump have been saying, and Kellogg and these guys that have been hired to the Trump administration. Assuming we see a ceasefire around current lines, Ukraine will have to be able to defend itself, which means that it will have to buy a huge amount of military equipment to defend itself. And again, that equipment is going to come from the US, right? So, and I mean, the reality is the cheapest way for Europe to ensure its own security is making sure Ukraine defeats Russia. And I think what's interesting is European leaders in recent weeks and months. There's an interesting debate now, right? Because I guess within the Trump administration, or some within the Trump team, or think that Trump can assume the presidency, call an end to the war straight away on day one. It sounds nice. It's a nice soundbite. But the reality is, what we know about Putin is Putin will not stop here. He wants the whole of Ukraine. NATO doesn't invade countries in Europe. Russia does. It's invaded Ukraine. It's invaded Georgia. It's invaded Moldova. Russia has a track record of doing this. It will continue to push Ukraine and continue to take advantage of Ukrainian weakness to take more territory. It will continue to try to take more territory in Europe because Putin is a colonialist, imperialist. That's his nature. So Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. So we need to give Ukraine the resources to be able to defend itself and the rest of Europe, right? So, and the sooner we do that, that I mentioned that 1% of GDP extra in defense that we need to spend. Why is that? And the only reason we need to spend in Europe or in NATO an extra 1 percentage point of GDP on defense is Russia. So, if we help the Ukrainians defend themselves, that's the most cost-effective way of reducing our own defense spending longer term.
Well, Tim, just to put closure on the point about how the Republican Party in the United States is screaming about how much it's costing the American people. And again, you know more about this than I do, but isn't it true that the net amount that the American government is spending to assist Ukraine amounts to about 1% of our defense budget?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the figures are, per year, the US spends about 800 billion on defense total, right? The US contribution per year so far, in terms of the military contribution to Ukraine, is probably about 40 billion a year, right? So, do the math yourselves. Very small percentage of the total goes to Ukraine.
And again, you must add on to that, as we've said, what the American defense industry is taking back into sales. I would take that off the top, which again is cutting into the net of how much we're spending there. And as you just eloquently said, look how much we will get if we actually pour into Ukraine what is needed. What a small investment it is to defeat Russia, to stop them from defeating Ukraine, taking over Ukraine, as you just said, taking over all the resources of Ukraine, which are pretty substantial, as well as the manpower. They will absorb the Ukrainian army, which is now at least, the second best in Europe and certainly the most battle tested, for less than 1% of our budget. But again, I just wanted to put closure on that because it's a ridiculous argument among many ridiculous arguments that are put forth by the Republicans here in the United States. Getting to Russia now, to circle back there as to the sanctions, what effect it is having on Russia. Let's get to the Russian people. I mean, I've been saying for almost 3 years that this is the war of the Russian people. I get flack about that. I don't care. Sure, it's Putin. If it wasn't for Putin, there wouldn't be a war. Possibly, but it's also the Russian people's war. You know that the old saying is that the Russians have a refrigerator economy. If they walk to their refrigerator and it's okay, everything's fine. If not, they're going to storm the Kremlin. Are they? And if not, when might the Russian people, the average Russian, not the oligarchs, start to feel the pinch about the sanctions? And if not, What must be done to make the average Russian person start to feel some agony about the sanctions and try to pressure Putin to end this war?
Well, you're right. I mean, that insulation I mentioned earlier, the 600 billion plus of foreign exchange reserves, have provided a lot of durability, right? I think, the enforcement of secondary sanctions, as I mentioned on MOEX, on Gazprom Bank, they will begin to squeeze Russians. Inflation is rising, interest rates are rising. The economic cost will gradually increase. We're likely to see Russians will have to pay more for imports, and goods more generally will become more expensive. The sanctions are just one part of the kind of piece, though. If you think of the pressure on Russia, Russia is still losing a lot of casualties, right? I mean, eventually, interestingly, we've seen recently that Russia reduced some of the social benefits available for the veterans and people coming back injured from the war. I mean, it suggests that difficult choices are having to be made. And this is what it's all about, right? I mean, we have to ramp up pressure on Russia so that Putin makes the right choice. And the right choice is to negotiate for a peaceful settlement, right? If he thinks, the Russian economy can just continue for another 5 years or longer, there is no particular social or economic impact on the domestic population, there's no political risk to him, he will think he can continue this war. It's really, really important that we maximize pressure in the short term to change his calculus around the war, and for him to realize that the longer the war goes on, the more risks there are to him. There is a risk of a much more serious economic situation. There are risks of living standards in Russia falling more aggressively. The ruble could collapse. They'll be forced to massively increase interest rates. That could result in runs on banks. I mean, there are all those risks that ultimately would be a risk to Putin's popularity at home. And it's only kind of 18 months ago or so that we had the Prigozhin, the Wagner mutiny. I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Putin could face another threat internally. I mean, only in the last couple of weeks, we saw the Assad regime collapse in Syria. No one expected that. That collapse has also underlined Putin's own vulnerability, that Putin didn't have the resources to defend his friend Assad in Syria. And now he's been forced into Putin, that is, has been forced into a humiliating retreat from Syria that, there are question marks about his ability to maintain, the naval base at Tartus and its neighboring air base. And also, obviously that is key for Russia's roles in Africa, etc. So, Putin has vulnerabilities. We just need to be clever in exploiting those vulnerabilities for our own benefit. And, our own national security interest at this point in time has to be to make sure that Ukraine survives, that it doesn't lose the war. Russia is not victorious because, as you mentioned before, if Russia wins this war, the threats to Europe increase by multiples, right? We will have to increase defense spending, probably not to 3% of GDP, but something probably closer to 4% of GDP. That's the level that we had at the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union in 1989-91.
Well, Tim, you brought up Syria. So I was going to ask you about this a little bit later. So let's get into it now. That was a disaster for Putin. Let me ask you, what do you think, in your opinion, that tragedy, that disaster, that failure for the Russians will mean for Putin, and how it's going to play at home for him? Do the Russian people give a damn about that? I know they don't get all the news, but they get the news enough. They know what happened. Is this going to mean anything to them? Do they tune it all out? What effect, if any, do you think this will have for the domestic audience in Russia? The total collapse of the Assad regime and Russian support.
Well, as I said before, I mean, it underlines this type of regime, authoritarian regimes, can be quite brittle, and they have vulnerabilities, and it often doesn't take much to have a very surprising result. So I think it would, it's clearly forced Putin to make difficult choices. I mean, again, underlying his vulnerability, the fact that he wasn't able to sustain support for Assad, he would absolutely definitely wanted to have kept Assad in power. There's no way that Putin would have wanted this scenario. Absolutely not. But it's revealed that, you know, he had to make choices between Syria and Ukraine. He couldn't sustain, you know, to defend Assad, he would have had to double up military support for Assad in Syria. And that would have taken away resources from Ukraine. He wasn't able to do that. So I think it shows ultimately the weakness of Russia in its pursuit of the war in Ukraine. I mean, some people may argue, well, if he's withdrawing from Syria, he could concentrate his resources on ensuring a victory in Ukraine. Well, possibly. But I think the key takeout for me is just there's no way Putin would have wanted this to happen, right? It shows his weakness, his vulnerability, and he'll probably change his calculus into going into those negotiations. Again, a long war brings risks. I mean, many people have argued that, you know, Putin can just wait it out, right? Russians are very hardy people. They're used to difficult times. You know, they lived through the Second World War and all that kind of stuff, the Soviet period. They can survive much longer than the Western alliance. Well, I think the experience of Assad in Syria is not necessarily. And I think Putin will also take that conclusion that the longer the war goes on, the more the risk that he will end up having to flee to North Korea in a similar situation to Assad. And the clever thing for him to do would be to sit down and negotiate some peace deal now with Ukraine, possibly under Trump.
Well, you know, you're right. I mean, I say this all the time. The Russian people are very, how can I say? They're used to suffering. I mean, you summed it up very, very well. I mean, they look at their lives, some of them, as one long period of suffering that they just have to endure. But let me ask you this. I talk to people quite often that are in Russia, outside of Moscow, in the smaller cities and in the oblasts. And right now, a lot of them are telling me there are food shortages. In fact, in some of the supermarkets, and I know it's made, you know, the internet in some areas, they're locking up butter. Eggs are still crazy. There's just a real food shortage. And what is available is much, much, much higher. People that I talk to are having a very hard time just surviving now. They always do. But right now, it's a matter of paying the rent or buying food. What do you think about that? Do you think that is now a serious problem, or is a lot of this that you see on the internet just clickbait? Although, as I said, I talk to people inside Russia, and it's an issue right now. It's a real thing.
You know, it's difficult because, you know, the Putin propaganda machine is probably more powerful and clever than the Soviet propaganda machine, right? And, you know, the narrative Russians are getting on their state TV are still very one-sided, not very balanced. You know, it's all kind of packaged around some patriotic war and all this kind of thing. You know, I think combinations of things been put together. I mean, the human cost of the war, the hundreds of thousands of Russian dead, hundreds of thousands of Russian injured. I mean, they're all coming back home. You know, this was supposed to be a special military operation over in 2 weeks. It's 1,000 days plus, going on to 3 years now. You know, what does Russia really gain from this? I mean, you know, if Russians really sit down and think about it, you know, they're an international pariah. As I said, thousands of Russian casualties. Russia's economy is definitely in a weaker place than it was 3 years ago. Ultimately, Russians are poorer. They're going to be much poorer going forward because of this. You know, one would hope that, you know, Russians, you know, begin to ask questions of their leaders or this leader and make different choices, right? Put pressures on him to stop the war and come to terms over Ukraine.
You mentioned, and I think you're correct, of course, that the National Bank, the Bank of Russia, is going to increase the interest rate to 23% this week. At what point, Tim, do you think, number one, how high do you think it'll go in 2025? And at what point will that actually start to really affect the average Russian for all kinds of different reasons? Where's the breaking point there? How high do you think it'll go? And where is the real breaking point where the average Russian is just going to start saying, that's enough?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The Trump administration, I mean, who knows what the Trump administration's policy is going to be to Ukraine and the peace in Ukraine. I mean, some of the apologists for Trump have argued that he will use max pressure on Russia like he's supposedly going to use on Iran. I mean, the US still has plenty of tools in its arsenal, right? There's been suggestions only last week. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, our current Treasury Secretary, was suggesting that the US could move to sanction Russian energy and oil exports. Remember, they haven't particularly sanctioned those yet. They've made it difficult to transact or Russia to get the revenues from those oil exports, but there's been suggestions that could be sanctioned. They said that immobilized Russian assets could be transferred to Ukraine. There's plenty of things the West can do to further tighten sanctions around Russia. Now, that will make things much more difficult for Russia. It will put more pressure on the ruble. It will reduce the amount of foreign exchange reserves Russia gets. It would, we could see a currency crisis. If the West can definitely do it, they have the tools to engineer a currency crisis in Russia. Absolutely. But it will depend on, how far Trump is willing to go, right? His team are suggesting that if Putin doesn't play ball, they're willing to, play hardball with Putin. I mean, we'll find out soon whether Trump, means what he says and says what he does, right? I mean, it's interesting that I've been in conversations this week with various Ukrainian politicians and policymakers, and I've asked them, what would happen if the Trump team come in and it's a bad deal? And a bad deal is basically just a ceasefire with no assurances in terms of security, no assurances about NATO. Essentially, it's just Putin would take that as a temporary stop. It's a temporary stop to rearm Russia to be ready to go in again. I mean, unless the Ukrainians get assurances that it's a real peace, it's a permanent peace, and that depends on security. It's either we provide the Ukrainians with the military facilities to be able to defend themselves, like an Israel scenario, we give security guarantees on a bilateral basis, or we get some NATO membership. But in the end, Ukraine has to be able to defend itself. Well, the Ukrainians told me, if we don't get proper security guarantees, we're going to continue to fight, right? So the Trump administration, will have to think really carefully about this. I mean, the Ukrainians are not stupid. They're not going to take anything. They have the ability, they have the willingness to fight on. They do have resources to sustain a war for a significant amount of time. A deal has to suit the Ukrainians as well as the Russians, right? And Putin needs to know that he can't be, let's hope, even if his friend Trump gives him an incredibly favorable deal, there's no certainty the Ukrainians would take that. And then Putin would have to fight a longer war with continued risks to both in terms of loss of life, loss of military resources, and a further weakening of the Russian economy. So again, I would hope that the Trump administration understands the importance of ensuring a sustainable peace for Ukraine. It means providing Ukraine with sufficient security to be able to defend itself or with its allies defend itself, and putting enough pressure on Russia to make sure that the option of going in again is not on the table for Putin. And he understands, actually, that if he agrees to a peace, but he doesn't abide by that peace, the overwhelming action will be taken by NATO and its allies to penalize Russia for such action in the future.
Well, I agree with you. I can't see any scenario in which the Ukrainians under Zelensky are going to accept any peace deal that does not involve a guaranteed membership in NATO and guaranteed security arrangements for protecting what the Ukrainian territory, the integrity of Ukraine, which is going to involve, I'm sorry, NATO. It has to. They can't just give lip service. Ukraine's heard lip service for 10 years now. and they're not going to buy it. And you're right. If Trump comes up with some ridiculous deal for Putin that is not good for Ukraine, they'll just keep on fighting, even if it comes down to guerrilla warfare at the end of the day, which could take years. They do have the resources, and they're just not going to give up. Tim, what do you think about the recent talks between France and Poland? There's been a lot of joint security agreements, not a lot, but a few between UK, Germany, Poland, and some others to guarantee the security of Ukraine. What do you think about the most recent talks between Poland and France to guarantee the security of Ukraine? Should there be successful peace talks?
I mean, good if it happens. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, I mean, Ukraine's experience with guarantees and memorandum, think about the Budapest Memorandum. We've not lived up to our assurances historically, right? If I was the Ukrainians, I would perhaps only trust in my own ability to defend the country as I'm not Ukrainian, but as a Ukrainian's ability to defend the country. I would demand, again, my preferred status for Ukraine would be like a state of Israel status, that they get everything conventionally to defend themselves, the full spectrum of Western military technology. And, we've seen in this war that, Western military technology still outbeats or beats Russian technology. If we give Ukraine everything to defend themselves, they can defend themselves. They have the motivation, they have the innovation, the skill set. What they need is financing and the military kit. Right, that's the key. And there's this idea of making Ukraine like a hedgehog, that Russia will not attack because it knows it will get an absolute bloody nose if it goes in again. Right. I think we'll see what happens. But Ukraine is not sustainable unless a peace assures security. Because rebuilding Ukraine, I mean, there's been lots of different estimates of the cost of the war in Ukraine, anywhere from $500 billion to $1 trillion, right? The cost of reconstruction. The danger is that a peace is not secure. So in what's left of Ukraine that is run from Kiev, it will not see significant foreign investment. It will not see significant economic development as a result of that. The economy will perform on a subpar basis. Millions of Ukrainian soldiers returning home will be disappointed, frankly, because they fought the war, they've expected change. They're assuming their country is going to be on a Western orientation towards NATO membership and EU accession. They've assumed it means prosperity, rule of law, all those kind of things. But if ultimately we lose the peace, like we did in Iraq or plenty of other places that we've seen Western intervention, the danger then is that Ukraine may be socially, politically unstable, and Putin may get what he wants, not through war, but by undermining Ukraine politically and socially, right? So, and the key there is security. Investment will come to Ukraine if it's a secure place, like South Korea after the war in the Korean Peninsula, right? I mean, if Russia is not lobbing missiles and bombs over the border, if international business thinks that Ukraine is a place that it can invest in, the country has a great future, right? It's a low base recovery, lots of reconstruction needs. It's proven itself in lots of different areas of the economy, military, industrial. Assuming Europe is going to have to spend lots of money on defense in the future, Ukraine has what it's learned in this conflict is remarkable. It's the cutting edge of defense innovation at the moment, and I think its defense industries will do very well. Agro food, black earth soil, black earth soils put in a very good place. Again, Ukrainian farmers and agro food exporters have shown great innovation in continuing to sow and harvest and export product in very difficult circumstances. So, Ukraine has a great future, but it doesn't unless it's secure. That's the key, and that's the absolutely key to the peace deal. I just hope that I hope Trump understands the importance of Ukraine, and that a peace has to be sustainable, right? A ceasefire, like a Christmas Day ceasefire, is not good enough, right? It won't be sustainable, right? And investment won't flow to Ukraine if investors think that Russia is going to continue attacking and there's going to be a risk of invasion.
Well, let me go out on a limb here and say that in answer to your question, Trump understands absolutely nothing about Ukraine. I'm sorry. He really doesn't. He doesn't read. He doesn't analyze. He reacts whatever he feels like at the moment. And as you know, his entire life philosophy is based on a transactional type of a life. So if he thinks it's good for him personally, not the United States, not the West, if he thinks it's good for him personally, whether through feeds his ego or feeds his wallet, then he's going to do it. If he doesn't, he won't. It's as simple as that. And I think it shouldn't have to be said, but I'll say it anyway, that Trump's boast about solving this war in 24 hours is, of course, ridiculous and nonsense. But, you know, those around him, I can't imagine some of them, the military folks or intelligence folks anyway, don't realize or do realize, of course, that Ukraine's never asked for troops. They've never asked for NATO or the American military to come into Ukraine and fight their battles. As you know, they've only ever asked for the means to fight the war: ammunition, training, weapons, and financial support. So if we still at this point don't understand that by giving them the financial and military support, we are going to keep American troops and Western troops out of Ukraine, then all is lost. But Ukraine, like you said, will keep on fighting anyway. Let me close it out with this, Tim, because we have to go. Put on your prognosticator hat and look into your crystal ball. I know you're not well, let me just ask you, where do you think this is going to go after January 20th? Do you think that Trump is going to, what do you think he's going to do? What do you think NATO's going to do? What do you think, what's going to happen in 2025 in the war in Ukraine?
There will be negotiations. I think Trump will try and impose a subpar deal on Ukraine. And either the Ukrainians will be encouraged by Europe to take that because Europe will suggest that they'll continue to fund them and to provide enough money for them to be able to defend themselves. Or the Ukrainians may walk away and say this deal doesn't guarantee our security. We prefer to continue to defend ourselves and ask Europe to continue to fund it, which Europe will have to in any scenario, because as I said, if Ukraine is defeated, that's a disaster. It's an existential threat for the whole of Europe. And I think enough countries in Europe realize the continuing threat from Russia. You know, obviously the Baltic states, Poland, these countries are in the front line. They absolutely understand Russia. Interestingly, I think the Scandinavian countries have woken up pretty quickly. Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Finland obviously recently joining NATO, and the UK. I mean, you know, opinion polls in the UK still show strong support for Ukraine. So I think there are enough countries in Europe to continue to will continue to fund Ukraine sufficient to enable it to continue to defend itself in the event that Trump walks away. But I have to say, I mean, I'm nervous. I'm nervous about the Trump administration. I'm nervous about Trump, not as you mentioned, not fully understanding the Ukrainian scenario, not understanding the risks, being too enamored of dictators and egos and all those kind of things. And also, I mean, there is certainly a philosophical element in MAGA that I guess has this, long-term desire, this idea that China is the primary threat. And I think there's a desire to stop the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible so the US can ally with Russia against the long-term threat from China. That kind of worries me, that ultimately there's this idea of this Judeo-Christian kind of alliance against China that some in the MAGA world think is important. I would say that if Ukraine loses, forget about Western liberal market democracy. This is what we're fighting for. Ukraine's fighting for anyway. It's about our defense.
And we'll have to leave it there. Timothy Ash, fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Center at Chatham House in the UK. Another terrific discussion, Tim. You stay safe and stay sane.
My thing. Thank you very much.